Slides.
Okay, does everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to say welcome to everyone who's joining us for the Brown Bag today. My name is Judy, and I'll be the student assistant host. We like to acknowledge that Cal Poly Humboldt is on the land of the Wiyot peoples, including the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. And welcome to OLLI. Here at OLLI, we believe learning should never end. We are here to provide our community with the opportunity for extended learning and academic engagement. We want to thank all the friends of OLLI whose support makes the weekly brown bag presentations possible. Some OLLI memberships include lower class fees, first priority registration. You will gain a Cal Poly Humboldt email account, which will give you access to the professional version of Zoom. You'll get a discount on the Jack Pass, eligibility for scholarships, discounts at local businesses, participation in our special interest groups, library access, and gym and recreation center access. And I'd just like to talk about some of the upcoming classes. We have some nutrition classes. We have a Zoom class coming up and some art and health classes as well. And every Friday we have the Let's Connect. And this is just a fun group where we get to meet and talk about different topics each week. So it lets you get to know the other people at OLLI. And to access previous brown bag lunches, you can access them through navigating to the OLLI website, selecting the news events in the top toolbar, and clicking the brown bag presentations, and this will take you to the homepage. And you can locate missed a presentation, click out the archive, and then you'll see all the previous brown bag lunches. And just here's some of our information. You can contact us through email at olli@humboldt.edu. You can call us at 707-826-5880. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And I'm going to take it to Jane, who will introduce our presenters for today.
Welcome, everybody. And if you haven't yet registered for classes, please do. We'd love to have you do it. And if you haven't become members, I presume you have, but if you haven't, that would be wonderful. We need to build our membership back up to 1,000 where we were before the pandemic. So we hope that you can do that or encourage your friends to do that so we can keep these programs going. Let's see. Our speakers today have been here before and we welcome them back because every year there's a new Alzheimer's conference and they give the latest and greatest of what's going on. Claire Day is the Chief Program Officer for the Alzheimer's Association Northern California and Northern Nevada chapters. She is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University in 1993. Prior to joining the Alzheimer's Association, she worked in the long-term care field as a patient and family advocate. Kim Coelho is a senior community engagement manager for the Alzheimer's Association, who received her BA in journalism from HSU and a master's in science in community health from Austin Peay State University. It's your turn, Claire. Thank you for coming.
Jane and Judy, thank you very much for that wonderful welcome. And I'm so happy to be with all of you here today and joined by the wonderful Kim Coelho, who I always love doing a presentation with. So without further ado, I will start with our presentation here. I'm just sharing my slides here. So if I'm going to ask actually Judy if she can give me a heads up that it's showing properly because I can see your picture. So if I can get a thumbs up that it's working.
It's good.
Awesome.
Good.
Thank you so much.
And if people have questions, please put them in the chat so we can deal with them later on in the
Yes,
presentation.
they'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so we'd like to ask you to hold off until the end for questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I tend to go down rabbit holes when we do that, and I want us to get through the content. And I really appreciate being invited back every year, because while some of this feels like it might stay the same year over year, there have been some significant advances in the last several years, and a couple of report outs that are really going to be important for us to talk about. But even though you may have seen some of this content before, I do want to start with a little bit of level setting about really understanding why this is such an important topic. What we've learned today about Alzheimer's and dementia, about early detection and diagnosis, some really important updates in both treatment and risk reduction. So let's start with a little bit of level setting when we talk a little bit about Alzheimer's and dementia. And if you've been before, you know that there is a difference. We talk about dementia as that umbrella term, right? It's that loss of function of enough severity that it impacts our abilities to do our activities of daily living, things like bathing and dressing and going to the grocery store, all of those things that involve memory, that involve thinking, that involve our using our executive function. All of those things can be impacted by dementia. They can be cognitive symptoms. Memory loss, of course, is that most commonly thought of symptom when we think about Alzheimer's and dementia. And what's important to think about with memory loss is the type of memory loss, right? So we have three types of memory, right? We've got our short-term memory. That's our ability to remember things like what we had for breakfast this morning and whether we took our medication, whether we put the kettle on the stove or turned the oven on. There's our long-term memory, those memories that are associated with things from well in our past, like who our first grade teacher was or the color of the curtains in your bedroom growing up. And then there's the third type of memory that I like to talk about, which is our sensory memory, right? That's our memory associated with a sense, smell, touch, taste. I always use the example. I was born in England and we moved to America when I was 10 years old in the month of August to the city of Philadelphia. And if you know anything about Philadelphia in August, you know that it is hot and humid, something that if you've ever been to England, you might think doesn't happen very often. And not to age myself, but Judy, back in the day when you would land a plane at an airplane, they would roll out a set of steps onto the tarmac. There were none of these fancy jetways that you walk on and off to now. So you walked right out into the elements at the Philadelphia airport. And I remember that very first trip, I walked to the front of the plane and this sort of wave of humidity hit me. That's a sensory memory, right? When I experience that first sort of really humid day or humid air, it always sort of takes me back to that. And that's what we mean by sensory memories. Well, dementia impacts mostly in the early stages, short-term memories, right? We start to see as the disease progresses that long-term memories can be impacted, but not always. And I think it's that short-term memory that is really the early detection, early sign, because it's the one that impacts our ability to sort of stay as independent as we possibly could be. It also impacts behavioral symptoms, there's psychological symptoms, but dementia is that umbrella term. So underneath that umbrella term, you would see all the different biological causes that are creating the loss of thinking and the ability to impact daily life. And as you see here, Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. And then followed by vascular dementia, which is the dementia caused by having strokes, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal degeneration, and then there are other types of dementia. And it's not, unfortunately, as uncommon as you would think that people could have more than one type of dementia. So you might have Alzheimer's disease and the biology of Lewy body dementia, for example. I think what's important to know, though, is that regardless of the type of dementia, the impact is the same across the spectrum, and it may present differently. And researcher is helping us to understand how to sort of detect these different types. Prior to the last probably 5 years, it was really hard to know the differences in clinical settings between some of these types of dementia, and we're learning more and more about them. And tools are advancing for us to really be able to understand the differences as well. Some of those differences are helping us to really understand the biology of some of these different types of dementia a little bit clearer. We talk a lot about Alzheimer's disease because it is the most common type of dementia. And this is just to give you a little bit about what we mean by the biology of the disease. So when you see these changes in a person, there's a biological change happening to our brain. And so this really illustrates in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease what that would look like. Alzheimer's disease is characterized by two hallmark symptoms or characteristics: a buildup of beta amyloid in the brain, which essentially deposits around the cells in our brains and causes these, what we know now as these neurotic plaques in our brain on that left-hand side of your screen. The second hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is what's called a neurofibrillary tangle. It's essentially a tangle of a protein called tau. Tau is like a transport system in our brain. It takes messages in our brain from one part of the brain to another, and almost mimics like a railroad track. If you picture like a railroad track, that's what happens in the brain with this tau protein. And what happens in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease is that train track gets bent, right? And so the tau ends up depositing where that bent system is, and as opposed to being able to go from where it starts to where it's supposed to finish. And what that results in is these sort of neurofibrillary tangles in the brain. And so this buildup of plaque and these neurofibrillary tangles, illustrated here under a microscope, are what cause, then, you can see on the right-hand side, significant changes to the structure of our brain. And you see the left side of that healthy brain, a real difference between what you see on the right side of the brain. Huge areas in the center here, huge gaps that you can see here, and really that atrophy, that shrinking of the brain. And I like to show this picture for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's helpful for us to see that we really do mean a biological change. So this is, the brain is changing. This isn't just psychiatric symptoms, because sometimes it feels like that. But the other is because I think it helps families to really understand why some of the things that become really difficult for people with Alzheimer's disease happen, like remembering recent experiences, or remembering more than one step of an instruction. It sort of helps to clarify that there is a physical change happening to the brain that's resulting in their inability to do things the way you and I do them. So a little bit of level setting on what Alzheimer's and dementia is. We've made some significant advances in the last few years around early detection and diagnosis when it comes to Alzheimer's disease in particular, but we're starting to see more and more movement around investigating some of these diagnostic treatments or diagnostic tools for other types of dementia as well. And I'm sure it probably goes without saying for all of us here, the importance of early detection and an accurate diagnosis. There are, of course, medical benefits. Now more than ever, we have access to treatments for people with Alzheimer's disease in particular. But it also helps the person prioritize their health, think about what lifestyle changes they may want to make that could be helping even with the diagnosis, but also gives people an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, which could give them access to a future treatment. There's also emotional and social benefits, more time to plan for the future, to think about resources, to plan who should be making decisions for you, who should be, what kind of decisions you want made for you. You want to be active in those decisions. But we also see a financial benefit. The cost of knowing what you're treating, knowing what you're taking care of, has really been shown in evidence by a trial called the IDEAS trial, which used the idea of a PET scan, which up until last year was not available and covered by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. In the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, now is, which is a huge advancement in understanding the importance of early and accurate diagnosis. And the reason is we've shown that an accurate and early diagnosis can save money in the long run. Probably not a surprise to any of you. But we still know that diagnosing Alzheimer's disease is tricky. And for most people, the way that we are diagnosing Alzheimer's disease today is still the same way we have for decades. And that's by sort of ruling out anything else that could be happening. And it's a series of tests that evaluate your cognition, your any history of Alzheimer's or dementia, and really ruling out other things like stroke, brain tumor, infection, other things that could be causing the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And I say that the majority of people, that's how we're diagnosing today. That's true today, but I think we're starting to see this real advancement in the way we think about early detection and diagnosis and how to better prepare health systems to really be able to do this and do this well. And biomarkers is a way that we're really changing the game when it comes to early detection and diagnosis. So a biomarker or a biological marker is a part of you. It's a part of your biology that shows evidence of disease. The one you're probably most common with is if you've ever had a blood test to check your cholesterol or your blood sugar. That's a biomarker test. They're able to pull that blood draw and test that blood to be able to determine whether or not your cholesterol levels are low, good, bad, indifferent, right? Same with your blood sugar. Well, we are getting closer and closer to having that type of a test to show whether or not someone has evidence of Alzheimer's disease in particular. Not quite as far along in some of the other related dementias, but certainly in the realm of Alzheimer's disease, we're starting to see some real progress being made. Now, there's one that's already available. It's what's called cerebrospinal fluid, which is an analysis of your cerebrospinal fluid. This is taken from a lumbar puncture, which can actually predict the changes in your brain that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. Now, while it's available today, you would probably, if I could see you all in the room, I would probably see a lot of shaking heads in agreement say, is that least invasive? Is that something that everybody sort of wants to raise their hand today to say, yeah, I'm up for a lumbar puncture today. I'll go in and have one of those done. I'm not sure too many of you would probably choose to do that. I will say I've been told that it's not as bad as I make it out to seem in my talks. And in fact, Kim, I think it was when I was at the Humboldt Senior Center that I was reminded that it's probably not as bad as I'm making it out to be. But when you think about the ease and patient comfort, I think we would all agree a blood test would be better. Is that a fair statement? I can see a few of you. Denise, I can see you in purple, and I see you shaking your head yes. And we're getting really close to the implementation of a blood test approved by the FDA. So I'm gonna review a couple of results from a clinical trial that I think you might think are interesting, that show how accurate these blood tests are becoming. There's also, MRIs are being used to rule out symptoms. So you would most likely see an MRI done to rule out something rather than to be able, you can't see Alzheimer's on an MRI, but there's also some really cool stuff happening with retinal scans that's not quite as advanced as the blood biomarkers, but it's just showing more and more steps towards making sure that we know for sure that someone has a disease or doesn't. Because for so many years, Alzheimer's disease was diagnosed by just ruling out what else it could possibly be. And people were given a probable diagnosis of dementia or a probable diagnosis of Alzheimer's because we had no way to tell. And now science is really catching up and really helping us to show that we can modernize the way we're thinking about diagnosing Alzheimer's and dementia across all regions. And I think, the other thing to think about is not everybody can get to a PET scan. We know PET scans are now FDA approved, and they can measure that amyloid and they measure that tau, but not everybody has access to a PET scan. Almost everybody in the country has access to a blood test. So last year at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, we saw this test result of a test that showed participants participate in a PET scan, a blood scan, or a blood test, and a doctor's evaluation. So they did all three, and then they compared side to side. And not surprisingly, the blood test was 80% accurate according to the PET scan. The physicians were 55% accurate. Now, that is not a slight on physicians in any way, but those tests that I was just alluding to that rule out other things are very subjective. And so you could be having a bad day and not remember those three items that you're asked to remember, or not be able to sort of count backwards from 100 by sevens and take some of those subjective tests. Whereas blood tests and PET scans are going to be way more accurate because they're actually showing the biology in the brain. So that's kind of cool to see that we see this advancement. And then there was a second study that looked at a finger prick test, which was also great because when you think about a finger prick test, that sample was able to be dried and shipped between two countries, and the results held up. And so that's exciting because, part of taking a blood test is then knowing, how to store the blood, what temperature to store the blood, how to then run the test. And so that's all of these next steps that are coming. But then this year at AAIC, we saw a different blood test report out that was 90% accurate compared to a physician doing an evaluation. And you can see here in this study, it was a blood test compared to either a specialist or a primary care. Not surprisingly, the specialist did a little bit better, as they should, right? Because they've had a little bit more understanding and education on understanding some of these neurological diseases, whereas primary care are more generalists. So it's not surprising that they were a little bit less accurate than sort of geriatricians or neurologists were. But I think this is where we're starting to see some real promise in ensuring that everybody gets diagnosed accurately, but also the people that are presenting with symptoms get a test early, because I think as we're starting to see the advancement of some of these treatments, the earliest point of intervention seems to have the best opportunity. So it's really exciting to see these advancements. I think most importantly, where they're really shining is now being able to use these in clinical trials. I would say 10 to 20 years ago, in clinical trials, people were being enrolled in those trials using the sort of same ruling out method, which means that there is probably a good chance that half of the people that were in a clinical trial for a drug to test against Alzheimer's did not have the biology of Alzheimer's. We just had no way to test it. So it makes you wonder about some of those early results. Were they really failures, or did we just not have the right candidates in the clinical trial? And so, as I mentioned, this is really important as we start to think about treatment. And we know we've seen a lot of advances in treatments in the last few years. I want to warn everybody that this next slide is going to be very, very busy, but I'll promise to walk you through it, and we'll send you a copy of the slides at the end of the presentation so that you have them all. So this is where we've come in this landscape of FDA-approved treatments for Alzheimer's disease. And you can see at the top of your screen, Dr. Alois Alzheimer. We first saw the first description of Alzheimer's disease from him in 1906. Fast forward 90 years before we saw any sort of treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Not surprising, right? For many, many years, Alzheimer's disease was not accurately diagnosed. I can remember starting in nursing homes in the early 90s. We did not necessarily know the difference between Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Lewy body dementia, senility. We called it senility, right? That's what we knew it as. Every year we have an event called the Walk to End Alzheimer's, which I know you're all familiar with, and Kim's going to talk about in a moment. And part of the walk is a ceremony called the Promise Garden Ceremony. And we have 4 flower colors that represent people living with the disease, caregivers, people who have lost someone, and people who are looking to end Alzheimer's. And one of the stories represented in the recent walk I went to in Santa Cruz was a woman who was there because her grandmother had the disease in the 70s. She lived with her family, and at that time they called it senility and didn't really know how to treat it, didn't even know what to call it. Fast forward 20 years, her dad was diagnosed with then Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but there was no treatment. There was nothing to give him. They probably didn't even have access to Aricept, Exelon, or Razodine. And then 18 months ago, her sister was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and for the first time was given Leqembi, which you see here is a treatment to address the underlying biology of the disease. What a story, right? Spanning 50 years of someone who went from not even knowing, a family member not even knowing what to call it, to her sister being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease early enough to now receive a treatment that actually can change cognition, function, and behavior and slow the progression of the disease. And so that's what this slide is really illustrating, is that over the last 3 decades, we've seen the advancement from these symptomatic medications that really just are treating the symptoms to drugs that are now targeting the underlying biology of the disease. And it's taken a long time, but even in the last 5 years, what we've seen, the progression of research, it's all connected to those earlier slides that I showed you, right? The advances with biomarkers, the advances with things like PET scans, and really understanding the scientific abilities to be able to really conquer this disease. So this is sort of shows you the landscape of those drugs. There's a couple of advances that have made too. The ones that are in that sort of teal color here. I don't know if you can see my, can you see my arrow when I'm on here? Okay, thank you. Denise is my the person that I can see on my screen, so thank you for that. So here in 2020, we saw this is a drug that was approved for sleep, but proved to be safe for people with Alzheimer's disease. So for the first time, this drug here and this drug here, Rexulti, this is for behaviors and agitation, tested in an Alzheimer's disease population, which is a real remarkable improvement, because prior to that, these drugs were never, they're not new drugs, but they were never tested in an Alzheimer's population. So they were tested to be safe to give to people with Alzheimer's disease. And again, nothing wrong with these treatments, but they're really just treating the underlying symptoms, and they're not addressing the biology of the disease. The most important, I think, updates are these two right here. This is the class of monoclonal antibodies, and these are those new drugs that in the earliest stage of intervention are addressing cognition, function and behavior. And we're just beginning with some of these. It's important to know that these are only drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So remember in that earlier slide when I talked about related types of dementia, there are no treatments approved for those related types of dementia yet. We've still got a long walk up a big hill, but we've still seen some amazing advances. So it's nice to see that science is helping us move forward, even if we've still got a long way to go. And there's a lot still going on. So you can see here in the pipeline, we've got 127 Alzheimer's drugs being looked at. We've got 164 clinical trials. There were 33 new agents that have entered the pipeline just in this past year. And look at those volunteers that participate in either phase 1, 2, or 3 active trials, over 65,000 people, which is just remarkable. And I think it's interesting to see that we've got cognitive enhancement, not just disease modification, also looking at those care and support things around behavioral and psychiatric symptoms, as well as looking at not just amyloid and tau, but thinking about some of those other disease processes as well. And this is just for Alzheimer's disease. There's even more in the pipeline. There's over 600 clinical trials happening in addition to these that are looking at other types of dementia, that are looking at things like technology, how technology and AI can help to support Alzheimer's disease and dementia. That's going to be a real interesting one, right? To see how the advances in artificial intelligence, what they should be used for or could be used for to keep people safe at their home longer. But we want to see those things tested. So it's really exciting to see some of that as well. And in the meantime, we need to continue with understanding risk and what we can be doing, because some of this stuff we can't change, and can't change what how fast some of these things move. And we know there's so much that is out of our control, like our age. Age still today remains the biggest risk factor, right? 1 in 9 over the age of 65, 1 in 3 over the age of 85. We're an aging nation. We know that genes play a role, but it's not the only role. We know that you can have 0, 1, or 2 copies of a gene called the APOE4 gene that obviously puts you at the least to higher risk, but it's not the only answer. There are people that have a copy of the APOE4 gene and never develop the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And there are people that have Alzheimer's disease and those symptoms and don't have a copy of the APOE4 gene. So it's a risk factor. There are other genes that are being identified that are risk factors, but they're not modifiable. Right? Race, ethnicity, sex, or gender at birth, not modifiable. Women have a higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. About 2/3 of people living with Alzheimer's disease are women. And we know that African Americans are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, and Latinos are 1.5 times as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. A lot of research is trying to understand why. We thought that women, it was just because we lived longer, but research is helping us to identify that there may be more to that there may be hormonal factors that play an impact on our risk. But then there's this side here on the yellow that I love talking about, because it's those things that we can all be doing to decrease our risk, that we do have some control over. So we call those our modifiable risk factors, things like sleep, diet, exercise, cardiovascular health, environmental and lifestyle factors. That one's always a little bit questionable for me, because we're seeing some of the environmental factors around air pollution, wildfire smoke. There were some studies that looked at the impact of wildfire smoke, excuse me, on our risk for dementia. And we can't always change where we live. So while it is technically modifiable, we also know that sometimes people have to live where their family is, where their job is. where their life is, right? You can't always just pick up and move. Education level brain injury, a lot of research looking at the impact of traumatic brain injuries and what its impact on dementia is, as well as physical exercise, substance abuse, things like that, all have the potential to impact our risk. And so what can we do about that? Well, we know that there are things that we can do every day that can make a difference in our brain health, even lowering our risk of cognitive decline. And it's believed that it could potentially decrease dementia cases by 40%. We're seeing a lot of research emerge around some of these healthy lifestyle practices. And some of the research is even suggesting that doing multiple risk factors together could be the most impactful. And so it's all the fun stuff that nobody wants to talk about, but I'm going to show over the next few slides some actual research evidence that shows why we should be talking about some of these things and why we could be doing some of these things that can at least help to decrease our risks as much as possible. So the first is everybody's favorite topic, and that's talking about good gut health. And this study in particular, you might have heard me talk about this last year. This study in particular talks about the impact of constipation in particular, and that having infrequent bowel movements of more than 3 days was associated with 73% higher odds of cognitive decline. So when you think about the importance of good gut health, and you might be hearing more and more in the news about the microbiome and gut health, and hear things like probiotics and how important gut health is to our just overall health and well-being. There seems to be some association with good brain health as well. I think it's important to note that you can do all of these risk reduction things and still develop Alzheimer's disease. This is not the answer, but it's certainly, we do know that the more we take care of some of these healthy lifestyle changes, the lower our risk is of developing dementia. And so the take-home message here is that the gut and brain influence each other. And we're starting to see this impact in two ways. That people, not only people that have a certain these specific gut bacteria that could increase dementia risk, they're also identifying gut bacteria that has protective ones as well. And so eating the right foods and thinking about how to protect our gut the best that we can seems to really have an impact on lowering our risk of cognitive decline. And I think that what I'm learning about these risk reduction strategies is sort of everything that happens below the neck seems to be having some sort of impact above the neck. And there's really this sort of interconnection between gut health and brain health. So if you suffer from constipation, absolutely talk to your doctor about what you could be doing to either change your diet or help to ease some of that constipation. That could potentially be good for your brain as well. The next study I'm going to talk about, again, not a shock that ultra-processed foods are not good for us, right? I don't think anyone on this call is going to be surprised today that ultra-processed foods are not good for us. But what's really interesting here is that if you're consuming more than 20% of your daily caloric intake, and I think this was based on a 2,000 calorie a day sort of diet, it was associated with a 28% faster decline in global cognitive scores. So again, not shocking to hear that we should not be eating Twinkies and all of those ultra processed foods. What makes a food ultra processed from just processed is not only is it got sort of all the sort of packaged foods that you can't maybe read the ingredients, it's also low in protein and low in fiber. So really important distinction just between processed foods and ultra processed foods is that the ratio then between protein and fiber. But we're also seeing these studies are showing that if you make some slight changes, it can have a lot of positive benefit, and that it's never too late to try to make some of these changes. This year, we got a new report on the impact of processed red meat. Oh, so that's all of those good things like salami and pepperoni and bacon and hot dogs. But eating 2 servings per week of these processed red meats raises our dementia risk by 14% compared to those who had less than 1 serving a week. What was also interesting about this study, this is what's called an observational study. So they looked at people for 43 years, they followed people, over 130,000 people. But what was really interesting is that people that swapped out a serving of processed red meat for a serving of nuts, beans, or tofu every day might actually lower their risk of dementia by 20%. So again, what I take away from these studies when it comes to risk reduction is it's really all about moderation. It's not saying cut everything bad out of your life, because we all know that's not sustainable, right? If we've ever seen a friend who's tried to do one of these, really restrictive lifestyle changes or diets, a lot of times they do really well for a short amount of time. And then as soon as they start to introduce regular food back into their diet, all of that goodness sort of goes away. And it's because it's not sustainable. If you go to baseball games, there's nothing better than a hot dog at a ballpark, right? It's just sort of like, that's okay. It's okay to do that. 4th of July, all of those holidays, things. As long as we're not making it a part of our regular diet, making those small lifestyle changes over time can really have an impact on our dementia risk. We've seen this study report out before that looked at the importance of physical activity. But what I loved about this study was it looked at both strength and stretching compared to aerobic exercise in people who had mild cognitive impairment. And what they found was that both arms of the study, so people in one arm did aerobic exercise and people in the other arm did the strength, stretching, and balance training. Both arms had mild cognitive impairment, and after 12 months, neither arm of the study showed cognitive decline. Not everybody can do aerobic exercise. But here's something that you can take away, right? That doing even strength training and balance, even if it's from a chair, using those sort of elastic bands that you can use to do some strength and balance training, can have the potential to protect around cognitive decline. So you don't have to be able to run a marathon to do some of the exercise components that they're seeing some really good results in, and you can still see some cognitive benefits, which is great to hear. The next study is an older study, but is always worth talking about because it really talks about the importance of that cardiovascular risk and blood pressure. And we know that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. 25% of our blood from every heartbeat goes to our brain. So if you have high blood pressure, please, please, please talk to your doctor about getting ways to reduce it, whether that's through medication or through diet and exercise and lifestyle changes. Because you can see here, people that had a systolic blood pressure of 140 or higher had a 19%, people that were in the intensive arm and lowered their systolic to 120 had a 19% reduced risk for mild cognitive impairment and a 17% reduced risk for dementia. And so we're starting to see how all of these things like diet and exercise are really having an impact on the risk for dementia. And so you've heard me probably talk before, if you've been to this program before, about how the US Pointer study is putting this all together. They're looking at exercise, diet, they're looking at sleep, they're looking at gut health, they're looking at cognitive and social engagement. this is why I love presenting to OLLI, because one of the pieces that we talk about is the importance of learning new things. And OLLI has so many great classes that you can participate in, where you can start to kind of test your brain out a little bit. And we will see the results of this by this time next year. We should know whether or not this clinical trial worked. As you may have heard me say before, Northern California was a part of this trial. So I'm really hopeful that it worked. We have every reason to hope that that it will hold up to the trial that it was based on, which is the trial from Finland. And it was been really exciting to see participants make these changes and feel better about themselves throughout the study. So it kind of puts all of it together. We know one of the slides that I need to probably add back in here is really around the importance of good sleep, not just getting enough sleep, but making sure your sleep is healthy, meaning you don't have sleep apnea. If you think you have sleep apnea, get that tested because there's evidence to show that people with sleep apnea are at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as well. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that I have is that, there's just so much we still don't know about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And it feels at times that we are moving at a snail's pace at understanding some of this. And then other times it feels like we're moving really, really fast. One of the things that I think we're seeing huge momentum in is the way we think about diagnosing and treating Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And really excited to see how things like the GUIDE model, which is something that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are testing out by creating these sort of centers of excellence around the country. It's a pilot program to see whether or not having resources and making sure that people have access, equitable access to early detection and diagnosis and support services has an impact on the health and well-being of not just the person living with dementia, but their care partner as well. So very important, and starting to see this sort of real emphasis towards public health and Alzheimer's disease has been really, really important. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with our 24/7 helpline. I'm so grateful for my colleague Kim, who's there in Humboldt County, providing support services the best that she can, and she is a true champion in the area. And she and my colleague Vanessa are working on pulling together more in-person information and programs later in the year and early next year as well, because it is an exciting time. It does feel like it's been a long time coming and that there's still so much to do. But I feel more hopeful than ever in what is coming down the pike and the sort of future for tomorrow. So at that, I'm gonna sort of pause sharing my screen. And shall we take some questions here before we go to Kim? Would that be a good idea, Kim? Yeah, so I'm gonna, I can see the chat now. So I'm gonna sort of go through, one question that came out is around medications and illnesses like urinary tract infections can cause dementia-like symptoms. Jane, that's a great question. So I think it's really important to understand why when someone shows the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, they do get a diagnostic workup, because you're right, having a urinary tract infection can absolutely mimic the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. It can cause an increase in confusion. It can make someone a little bit more irritable. If you've ever had a urinary tract infection yourself, they're pretty uncomfortable. But any infection, not just urinary tract infections, but any infection in older adults in particular can cause some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, but that's not Alzheimer's, right? That's an infection. And so it's why I can remember when my mom had cancer, And she did not have dementia, but she had cancer, and her mood and behavior changed, and she got a little confused. And I was visiting, and I remember saying to the doctor, I think my mom has a UTI. And they said, no, we don't think she doesn't. She says she's fine. And I'm like, no. I almost wanted to say, I know my mom has a UTI. And finally, I persisted enough to where they ordered a test. I will say my mother was not happy with me that she had to then go back and give a urine sample, because they're not fun, but she did. And lo and behold, my mother had a UTI, because those symptoms, they're coming from my background at the Alzheimer's Association. I'm like, she's starting to act like someone who has dementia symptoms. And I know my mom does not have dementia. So really important. That's why early detection is so important, because there are other things that it could be. And so it's so important that we really understand. And it's why I think the tests are really a big step forward. And Jane, you're right. They're not necessarily definitive, but I think what's important is the cognitive. So when we understand the continuum of cognitive decline, we've really unraveled over the last few years the difference between having Alzheimer's disease and having dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. So those plaques and tangles that I showed you in an earlier slide develop anywhere from 10 to 20 years before we ever see a cognitive symptom. So I'm 53. If I get the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in my 70s, chances are that buildup of amyloid plaque and those tau tangles are starting now in my brain. I'm not symptomatic. I don't have the symptoms of dementia. And so it's kind of confusing, right? So dementia is the umbrella term, but it's also Alzheimer's disease, or dementia due to Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia, right? Dementia is the cognitive symptoms, is the function loss. And so what we're starting to understand now is that the biology is changing long before we ever see any of the cognitive symptoms. Where research is going to take us in the future, and we're not here yet, is to that place where, just as when you turn 50, you get a colonoscopy and you have a mammogram, you're preventatively having those tests at a certain age point, right, to prevent diseases. That's where we'll get with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. I just know it. We're just not there yet, because today we cannot say for sure that. So if you had, let's use a mammogram as the example. If you have a mammogram at 50 and they determine you have breast cancer, they treat the tumor, right? So if you were to get a PET scan or have the blood test to show that you have the biomarker, the amyloid or the tau, but you're not symptomatic, we don't know yet that these new treatments work on people who aren't symptomatic. They've not tested them. So that's what's going to come next, right? Is they're going to look at treatments that then potentially can treat the biology before the cognitive changes. But today, we don't even know we have the disease until we get the cognitive changes. So I know that's kind of confusing, but I think it's where we have to see the future. And I would agree. I think every drug that you you should weigh the pros and cons. These new medications, these monoclonal antibodies, are no joke. There are some side effects. They are expensive, although we are starting to see some movement in the insurance realm at trying to mitigate some of those costs. You're right, there is no magic bullet yet, but for some people, they've weighed the pros and cons, and that's the choice that they're making, because it does allow for more time for people to make decisions. I think at this point, we're not detecting early enough. I think we ignore the cognitive symptoms, and they're sometimes so slight in people that they get ignored for many, many years, because it's hard. It's so hard. So Jane also mentioned about, yes, the importance of exercise because of blood flow. I think you were just reiterating a point there, right? It looks like that's
Yeah.
the question. Yeah.
And I wanted to make a point. My sister lives in Virginia, so I'm 3,000 miles away, and I talk to her daily because she's had been in a wheelchair for several years because of multiple operations, back serious ones with anesthesia. And I've always worried about anesthesia. So I thought when she couldn't remember what she'd eaten for lunch half an hour before, I got really distressed and pretty strongly that you need to check what's going on. So they ran her through a series of tests, but it turned out when they cut back on her drugs, okay, because she was taking about 10 different drugs a day.
Mm.
And that eliminated most of the problem. I think she still has mild cognitive impairment at least. But, and have they done much research about anesthesia and its
Yeah.
impacts?
Yeah,
Yes?
they're starting to really look at that, Jane, because I would say, I don't know that there is, I don't know that I could concretely say that having anesthesia causes Alzheimer's disease. I don't think that's the issue. I think the anesthesia, if you are going to develop the cognitive symptoms of dementia due to Alzheimer's, or that having the anesthesia almost like speeds up that's what I'm tending to think, that it's more that it's not because you have it's not giving you the plaques and tangles. It's just speeding up the progression of the disease is what I think research is leaning towards, but it's pretty heavily being investigated right now, because I mean, if you think about the percentage of older adults that need anesthesia, it is scary. I'm not saying that it doesn't cause it. I think that's what research is trying to determine, but I also am with you that anesthesia makes me nervous in older adults, because of what we're seeing in sort of real case examples.
Yeah, I mean, it's significant. She had 8 major operations over 8 years.
Yeah.
with anesthesia.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that had a relationship, but and she's been unable to do physical exercise, etc. But the I think if you have an option between having a local to do something
Yeah.
and getting general anesthesia, do the local. I had my the screws put in my hip with a general. It feels really odd to see your leg hanging up there. You can't feel a damn thing and hear them and watch them do it. But at the same time, no problems with anesthesia at all.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be very protective of your brain, my experience is that it's better not to have to do that. You can do the same thing with a colonoscopy and try to minimize your exposure to general anesthesia.
Yeah, and I see another question about the new medication. So I will say that I think so. There are 3 monoclonal antibodies that have been approved by the FDA. The first one, Aduhelm, I think came out of the gate early, did not meet its primary endpoints. It met its secondary endpoints, and I think that's probably the one you're referring to, that had pretty flimsy results. And actually, the company has made the decision to discontinue it as of November of this year. Leqembi and Kinsula, or lecanemab and donanemab, the last two that just were approved, their data is pretty good. I mean, it's pretty firm. And donanemab, which was the one that was just approved a few months ago, in particular, what was really interesting about donanemab is that people in the clinical trial got a predetermined level of amyloid clearing prior to their first infusion. And once they had that clearing done, they didn't have to take the infusion anymore. And so I think that there's still, I think, are risks associated with these drugs. Anytime you have an amyloid related drug, you're going to have this potential risk of what's called ARIA, or amyloid related, what's the I stand for, abnormality, imaging abnormality, which is essentially what people are seeing as the major risk of these drugs. So it is absolutely something that you need to think about. But I would say that the data with the second and third is pretty solid for those that were in the clinical trial. But I think it's, you've got to weigh the risks with the benefits. What percentage of people with mild cognitive impairment proceed to Alzheimer's or other dementia? That's a good question, because mild cognitive impairment is a risk factor. It's not an inevitability, but they estimate that anywhere between 50 to 80% of people with MCI go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. And then drinking enough fluids, helps prevent, what's the risk of concussions and dementia? So I think we're starting to see a lot of research emerge around head injury and concussions and dementia. In fact, the major funder of some of that research is the National Football League, which is not surprising, right? That they would have sort of an invested interest in understanding the risk factors. So, I think I'm not as familiar with some of the research that's coming out around the actual numbers of concussions and dementia, but I can tell you that it's certainly a risk and that it's being studied pretty heavily. So Jane, I look to be at the end of my questions.
You are at the end of the questions. I've read about, and not actually purchased, but read about a number of protocols from various and sundry doctors who've studied Alzheimer's that are available to address dementia and Alzheimer's. Has your organization studied those protocols and how effective they are? These are medical doctors who have been doing this. So I'm just curious about the research the association has done with respect to those protocols, which, I mean, they're the typical things. They're diet, exercise, sleep, the whole set of things, socialization, things like that. And then there are brain training exercises and things of that nature. And some of them are very credible. Have you delved into that research to see or how effective they are, or actually tested them at all on people? And are you planning to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's what the U.S. Pointer Study is doing. It is looking at exercise, diet, cognitive and social activity, as well as managing things like blood pressure, those cardiovascular risk factors. So we are funding a nationwide clinical trial that we will have the results of by this time next year. To date, there have been no other clinical trials that have shown the evidence that those types of lifestyle changes have an impact on preventing Alzheimer's disease. I think what we're going to learn is about the relationship between Alzheimer's and those lifestyle changes as the U.S. Pointer study reports out next year.
But you haven't specifically said, okay, here's this protocol that's being promoted all over.
Yeah, there's no there's no scientific evidence to show that it works.
It's all based on clinical, the particular doctor's clinical experience is what it boils down to. That's what these are based on.
Yes, and
protocols.
not studied under the rigors of a clinical trial.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's essentially observational data.
Observational data and anecdotal data.
And yeah, I think anecdotal is probably a better word for it.
And at what stage of development can you be most effective? Do you have to catch it before it manifests symptoms, or do you have to, in other words, at what level should we be trying to get people to change their lifestyles before they even get into their 50s?
Yeah.
Or once they're manifesting symptoms, you have to jump on it right away. Is that annual exam we all take that's paid for by Medicare worth anything?
Yeah. I would say yes to all three of those questions. I think I think we need to be talking about brain health for all ages, right? Not just older adults. I think we should be thinking about, and I think about some of the changes that we've seen over the years. You know, when I was a kid, I didn't wear a helmet on a bicycle or to go skiing, right? Those are all things that we've now do with our children because we've learned that head injuries have a long-term impact from childhood to older adults, right? So it's the same sort of thing. We've got to learn that the benefits of those cardiovascular risk factors have an impact on how we age healthily throughout the decades. But I also think, you know, one of the things that I love about some of these studies that have come out is that they have either been done with people with some cognitive symptoms or without, but people who are sedentary, right? So they're people that have the opportunity to make changes. And it's still it's having impact on people that you know, really had opportunity to make some changes, and we're starting to see that. So like when we saw the Mind Diet, for example, those are all older adults who did not have Alzheimer's disease, but they were not eating healthily. So they had room for improvement within their diet and made those changes, and that's where we got the evidence from. So that's what I like about some of those studies, is that they take people that it's not, and basically show it's never too late to make changes. And I saw another come in, what can we do about the wide use of processed foods? I wish I had an answer for that. I don't know that I have the answer to that question, but I think, you know, it's the reality is that eating healthily takes a lot of work and is expensive, right? And that's oftentimes why people don't do it. So I'm not trying to, I wish I had the answers, and I think your question is a really, really good one. What can we do for this? I mean, I think it's everything's so readily available, and I think in our like the process, we were talking the other day about, does anybody remember in the 90s SnackWells? We were all on everything was going to be low to no fat. Like that was the phase, right? And SnackWells, they were in the green packet and they were like supposed to be healthy cookies. Well, they were probably so ultra processed, right? They were probably, they're terrible for us. Like, but it was the craze. Everything had to be no fat. Everything had to be low fat or no calories. And I feel like what we need to do, okay, this is me. I'm taking my Alzheimer's Association hat off because this is probably not representative of the Alzheimer's Association, but it's just the basics, right? Just eat whole foods, like just eat homemade foods that we like. That's the stuff that that seems to, it doesn't seem to be rocket science. But I don't know, Kim, maybe you should start saying something so I stop talking on behalf of the association.
I agree 100%, Claire. It does take a lot of time. So we have a farm share we had for years that dictates pretty much what we eat every night. It does take a lot of time. Some evenings when I'm chopping and chopping vegetables, I'm like, oh, it would be easier to go through Taco Bell, but I just can't do that because I know how that food is made. And when I'm shopping at Costco, I stay away from all those prepackaged frozen dinners because I know they're not good for my brain. Yes, it takes time to eat healthy, but it's worth it, guys. So
Yeah, and Tom made a comment about processed foods. I think it is exactly that. I think it's going to be the preservatives, so I think if you're making your own homemade sausage and salami, that's probably not a processed red meat, right? I think you're probably good.
definitely.
All right. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. And back, Jane, to your comment about when should we start thinking about it? I've got one teenager left at home and then kids in their 20s, and I'm always preaching to them, you've got to, do stuff now because you're not going to be young forever. So, oh, super important. All right. I'm going to try to share my slides here. And let's see. Okay. Where is the, oh, my thing keeps disappearing. Where's the button to start the slideshow? Slideshow. Okay, here we go. All right.
Got it?
All right. Sorry about that, guys. All right. So Walked Into Alzheimer's, it is coming up soon, less than 3 weeks. So Saturday, October 19th. I know this date better than I know any of my children's birthdays. So let me scoot to the next one. So the Walked Into Alzheimer's, it started in 1989. It was branded under what was called the Memory Walk. And in its first year, 9 chapters raised 150,000. So now 34 years later, we hit a major milestone this last year. We achieved $100 million raised in just one walk season. So we have 600 walks across the country. The majority take place in September and October. So, and we're getting more and more people to come out to these events because more and more people are being diagnosed. So, and then folks want to support folks in their community that have this disease. So why do we walk? As Claire mentioned in her presentation, so we walk because we want to fuel critical progress in dementia science, investing in over 1,000 active best-of-field research projects in 53 countries. So I'll get occasionally from folks in the community, doesn't the money all stay here? Well, don't you want a cure or at least progress in the disease? And if we do want that, we need to fund the best scientists, and we don't care where they're located throughout the world. So but the money does stay local, and that you can call the 1-800 number anytime, 24/7. There's someone, whether you give a dime or not to this organization, we're there for you. So it definitely stays local in that respect. And also I'm here to give presentations and answer calls and support anyone with this disease. So we partner with clinicians to track outcomes of new treatments to improve the future of care. Current and future treatments that Claire mentioned will offer many that are facing Alzheimer's more time with people they loved. So that's super important. You always hear folks say, if I just had one more day with my loved one, or one more week, and that's what we're doing with these medications. So we're actually giving them more time back. A gal I spoke to not too long ago who's on one of these drugs said that she was actually able to continue to work. So, and that's important, especially if you're diagnosed in your 50s or 60s and you need to continue to work. Not everyone has the luxury just like, oh, I have this disease, I need to quit working now. So the next, we continue to fight for a future where treatments are accessible for all. We want to make sure everyone has access to these treatments, just not people that are wealthy, at every stage of the disease and communities everywhere. So the walk this year, like I mentioned, October 19th, here's pictures from last year. Yes, pets are very welcome at our event, so it's wonderful. We're going to have a pet sponsor this year. We're going to have pet biscuits and dog treats and waters bowls and stuff for them. It's at the Adorni Center. Check-in registrations at 9. And then from 9 to 10:30, we have different vendors. You can just walk around the room. We've got all these great booths set up, and you can learn about the disease more. You can visit the different teams that may be doing opportunity drawings and other stuff at the walk. At 10:30, we do our opening ceremonies, which is always really meaningful. And then at 11 o'clock, we walk. So it's a short little event, doesn't take a lot of time, but it means so much to folks in the community that have been diagnosed. So the latest facts and figures for Humboldt County was we have around 3,500 people that have Alzheimer's. And so when you show up to this event, it means so much to the folks that have this disease to feel like the stigma is taken away. They don't have to hide, they can be out among. So, and as you see with all the flowers, it's actually a very uplifting event. So we have a fundraising app. Like you have apps for everything else, we have an app now for the Alzheimer's Association Walk. So you can start or join a team on this. You can update your personal page, check your fundraising, send messages, deposit checks. This is cool. You can plant a virtual promise garden. So it's very easy. And we encourage folks, if you'd like to. My phone is trying to talk to me right now, sorry. Okay, you can register today. You can visit alz.org Humboldt Walk or scan this QR code. We also need volunteers. So you can also go to the alz.org/Humboldt Walk, click on the volunteer button. It generates an email to me, and then I'll be in touch with you. It takes usually most of the volunteer commitments on Saturday, 2 to 3 hours. So, and everyone has a wonderful time that's volunteering there. So we get a lot of high school kids. The Cal Poly Marching Lumberjacks are going to be back this year. They always kick off the event. So I would encourage everyone to register or at least donate to someone who's participating. So, all right, that's it for my slides.
And we have a number of thank yous to the two of you for coming and spending your time and sharing this information. And maybe we ought to plan on having another one next fall after you have the results of the pilot study. That would be wonderful. And I want to let everybody know that next week we get Lori Dengler back talking about Iceland, where the rift and hotspot collide spectacularly. She's always extremely interesting. And I look forward to seeing you all there. The week after that, by the way, on October 14th, we're having the League of Women Voters discussing the pros and cons of the statewide and some local ballot measures in November. So please put all these things on your calendar, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. And thank you ever so much to the Alzheimer's Association, to Claire and Kim.
And Jane, if you just saw in the comment section, Hallmark actually did a movie called Falling Together, and it actually, it's a fictional movie, but in it they have a Walked into Alzheimer's event. So if anybody's a Hallmark fan or you want to check it out, so.
Yeah, it was written, and I don't know if she produced it but the woman who starred in it is Ashley Williams. If you're a Hallmark fan, you will recognize her. She and her sister Kimberly Williams Paisley, they lost their mother to dementia, and she had shared with the Alzheimer's Association a few weeks ago that she happened to be in a meeting with Hallmark, and she was telling a little bit about the work that she and her sister do as advocates and sort of celebrity champions for the Alzheimer's Association. And one of the producers at Hallmark said, that sounds like it would make a good Hallmark movie. And so it was actually, I think for those of us that work at the association, it was such an honor to be able to see the walk so prominent and in such a big stage. But it was, if you were a Hallmark fan, it was a cute little Hallmark movie too. So it was a lovely, lovely day.
There's another question in the chat from Tom, if you can see that.
I see. Thank you. Very helpful. I leave for Connecticut tomorrow to visit my older brother and his wife, who was recently diagnosed.
Was
And
it about
then-
the red meat one? Because I think I
Yeah,
addressed
the red meat.
Yeah, I'm curious. Tom said, I'm curious about what it is in processed foods that makes them so harmful. I make my own homemade lean sausage and salami and would bet without the preservatives and processed garbage, it is not nearly as harmful.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think you're on to something there, Tom, and I would agree that if you're not using preservatives, because what was really interesting was that red meat by itself did not have, it did not have the linkage. It was only the processed red meat. So I think you're on to something there.
Preservatives wipe out your good gut bacteria.
There you go.
That's the link. So
There you go.
Thanks, Jane,
getting
for hosting
preservatives
us.
and most packaged foods have a ton of preservatives.
Yeah.
And that's what you want to avoid
Yeah.
because it's not preserving your health. It's preserving the items in the food that they want to last a year. So they have a good shelf life.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you can send questions if you have them to Claire and to Kim, and you can go back and watch this presentation on the OLLI website if you'd like to do that or reference. And you're going to send, are you sending me?
I'll send you the
copy of
slides. Yep.
That's wonderful. So if
Yeah.
anybody wants a copy of the slides, you can contact me at Jane.
Could you also send that to the OLLI email?
Yes.
Pardon me?
Yep, I will.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
then we'll both have copies, and if anybody wants them, you can harass OLLI or myself. We'll be happy to send them to you. Have a great day, everybody. It's gorgeous out. It's supposed to be in the 60s and maybe even 70 this week. It looks like it's going to be a phenomenally gorgeous week. Summer has finally arrived. Fall just left us.
Thank you.
So true, Jane.
Yeah, it's
Thanks,
kind of
everybody.
bizarre. Take some
Have
getting
a
used
good day,
to.
everyone.
Bye.
Take care.